Hello, everyone. We're back again, aren't we, Steve? Say hello.
Hello.
Hi. And people liked it enough for us to come back for another stab. And we're not going to talk about Ironsworn this time, or Starforged, even though Starforged is good, and we have established that. What
It
are we going to
is.
talk about this time?
We're going to talk about world building.
Hmm.
And of course, as part of world building, we should talk about the world creation mechanics in Irons. Oh, sorry. No, we shouldn't do that.
You've fallen into the first pitfall, haven't you? There, we just can't stop because we're the Ironsworn guys. That's
That's right.
new podcast name, the Ironsworn guys,
The
with a
Ironsworn
Z.
guys. Yeah.
Um,
I do feel as though there's an asterisk. I said that as a joke, but really the creating the world truth section in Ironsworn is phenomenal. And
mm,
so you would be remiss if you're into world building to not go look at that.
yeah.
But no, we're not going to talk about those things.
Um,
So we're going to talk about other stuff.
Funny you should mention that because I do have a video coming up about that very subject soon about doing the truth exercise. In a your £5 is in the post, Steve. That's what I pay for you promoting
Thank you.
videos on my videos. For everyone across the pond, that's about $2. But Steve said he'd do it for that. That's fine. He's cheap.
Yeah,
So we're talking about world building, something we very much enjoy. We've done a little bit of it on your channel before, haven't we?
we
What
have.
did we use to do? Because we were doing Davenar, weren't we, for your campaign?
Yes, we used the Game Master's World Building Guide, the Ultimate RPG Game Master's World Building Guide. It has been a while,
Yeah.
and I should have remembered that. But yeah, there are some awesome exercises. And actually, when we first talked about doing world building as a topic,
Mm-hmm.
I was going to trot that out, and I think you had um, a better idea of how to approach it. So I'm excited to get into that. But yeah, that's a really cool tool as well. And I can send you the link if you want to put it in the description.
Yes,
The doobly doo, as some people might say.
the doobly doo. Yes.
The doobly doo.
Yeah. And when we got to thinking about our favorite world building tools, there was something quite interesting, wasn't there, when we started sharing them? Is that like some of our favorite world building tools weren't actually world building tools at all. They're just things we've pulled from other games, some of it from character creation, some of them as general principles of play, and we kind of just use them when we build out our worlds for our games.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point when you're running a game, whether it's solo or for a group. There are so many different tools that you can use, and oftentimes you discover those tools and you can bring them from the context that they originated in, and you can translate them to be useful in whatever context you need them to be.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's a character creation tool, if it's just regular game mastering sort of advice, all of those things can, through the right lens, be used as a world building tool.
Yeah, 100%. And you should always be encouraged to kind of you dip into other games for things. Like you talked last episode about how you find oracles to be super helpful and super handy,
Mhm.
and that is just that's just a list of words on a table that you roll dice on that can be applicable to anything. Obviously, you can make them specific as you like to the game and the world that you're playing, but things are very flexible. Using other tools from other games isn't quite the homebrew extravaganza that people think it is. I think because I think in a lot of people's minds, people think that homebrew is actually making new game mechanics, and it can be, you can kind of take things and hack things as you want, but actually just using something from one game and another is just a really easy way to kind of learn how to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the first one we've picked two each, haven't we? And we could have picked
Mhm.
more, but we've picked two little kind of things that we like to help us when we're world building for our games, and we're going to talk about them. And the first one is one of mine, and it is from the game Dungeon World. So Dungeon World, written by Sage Latora and no one else that I can remember, is a great kind of application of the Powered by the Apocalypse engine. So you must know what that is now if you're listening to us speak. It's the thing that was invented for Apocalypse World, and the world building tool that I'm going to pull from this I actually thought was in Apocalypse World, and when I went back and reread it, it wasn't actually. It probably has appeared somewhere before Dungeon World, but this is the first time that I saw it, and it is basically one of the principles of the GM in this game, and I use it when I'm world building all the time. And that principle is to draw maps and leave blanks. And draw maps, leave blanks says Dungeon World exists mostly in the imagination of the people playing it. Maps help everyone stay on the same page. You won't always be drawing them yourself, but anytime there's a new location described, make sure it gets added to a map. When you draw a map, don't try and make it complete. Leave room for the unknown. As you play, you'll get more ideas, and the players will give you inspiration to work with. Let the maps expand and change. And why I like this so much is because I see a lot of people talking about their campaigns and talking about how they prep them and plan them. And we talked last episode about how our approach to prep has changed. And my approach to prep has changed with regards to map making in particular, because I remember, and looking through some notes to find something we're going to talk about later, I found, maps of mansions that had every single room and every single item, every single kind of corridor planned out. And, that mansion was in a large grounds and that was planned out, and it was in a village that was planned out. And it was fairly exhaustive in detail. And the thing is that's not wrong at all, because to use an example that we're going to talk about later, Blades in the Dark has, if you play it in the setting that is written, Doskvol, you can buy maps of that has every street mapped, and that is amazing. That's a really cool thing to do. But there is a certain something about, especially when a game is based around exploration and finding, actually having some unknown space. And I also mean that from the GM's point of view, because it's very often a thing. The GM has all the maps, they're hiding them behind the screen, and they know exactly what's off every merchant road, in every hamlet that the players are going to come across. But there is something hugely liberating about opening that process up and sharing that as a kind of collaborative storytelling tool. And why I like it in a world building sense is when you arrive somewhere, none of you knowing what you're going to find and figuring it out together. And draw maps, leave blanks is the most elegant way of phrasing that, and getting your head into the idea that, we are doing this together and we are going to fill out this world and we're all part of it. And it makes me hugely excited to look at a map. And I think the Dungeon World campaign that I ran, which is one of the very few campaigns I've ever completed. It took 2.5 years. It had a start, it had a middle and end, and everyone went away happy at the end of it. But it started with a map that we drew on paper between us, and we put I think 5 capital cities down. I think there was 5 provinces in this land that we wrote 5 capital cities, a little bit about each one, and that was it. We set off and everything else got filled out on the way. And I saw quite a famous YouTuber, I won't name drop them, doing some planning for an upcoming campaign, which will no doubt get millions and millions of views. But the map was in such exhaustive detail that I was like, and again, this is personal preference, where is the joy in exploration there? It's not a shared thing. It feels like the GM, you're discovering the things that I've laid out for you, rather than let's tell a story together. Let's build a world together. There you go. I've talked about that for a bit. Steve, what do you think?
Well, I think one of the reasons that you and I get along so well and collaborate so often is because we do think similarly about games and about world building and the way that we approach things. So I absolutely love this as well. And I'm definitely with you in being more in the camp of wanting to explore the world with my group of friends with the players at the table, rather than feeling as though I have to come to the table with a full spread of maps and locations and details. And also, I think I'm partially just lazy. And I say that as a joke, but also, we do talk about prep being play,
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean that all prep is equally fun for all game masters.
Yeah.
And I love me a good fantasy map, but I am not a cartographer, and I know that my the areas that I lack in creating maps, the skill that I lack there frustrates me more than the joy that I get out of drawing a fully fledged map.
Hmm.
And so I definitely I'm more in the camp of like, I want to sketch out a few things and then leave a space open for the players to discover those things.
Yeah.
But and this is not necessarily, like, I know you are not saying that it's bad to plan out and draw out a beautiful map, because that's somebody else's fun,
Hmm.
that they're doing. And I can say that in the game that I'm playing in right now, our game master is an incredible map drawer, and his maps are beautiful, and he has drawn a very detailed map of this city that we're running around in, with street names and all of these things. And while that's not necessarily the way that I approach uh, creating a situation, a game map, there is a certain joy that I find in running around that map and
Hmm.
being like, what's this building? And what's this building? And because I know that he's spent time enjoying making lists of different businesses, and he knows where all the taverns are in here. And so when our dumb characters go on a bar crawl because we're not really feeling like pushing anything forward, he pulls out his binder full of notes and has that list, and it's great, it's fun. um it's just not my style when I'm a game master, and I think that's one of the things that I certainly want to be very clear on, is that a lot of what we're talking about comes down to taste
Hmm.
and down to personal preference, like you said, Matt. And one of the great things about this hobby is that there are 1,000 different ways to play a game, and there are 1,000 little hobbies within this larger umbrella hobby that we can get into. And certain people are into drawing maps, and certain people are into painting minis, and all of these different things, and they're all cool in their own right.
Hmm.
It just comes down to personal preference. And so that's why I agree with you in that, like, draw maps, leave blanks is a, for me, perfect encapsulation of what I want to do when I'm starting a campaign,
Hmm.
because I want that map to become filled with things that are important to the players and the characters sitting around the table. And I don't necessarily care if the map is full of cool landmarks that I've thought up as the game master. Like, I want those things to matter to the
Hmm.
people there.
Yeah, that's a great way of kind of saying it. Like, you could arbitrarily come up with some of the coolest stuff you can think of, and your characters would be like, well, in the adventure we're doing, why would we want to go there unless you are railroading them or shoehorning them into a certain kind of funnel of story that you want them to go
Mhm.
down. And I think it's, when you talk about preference, it 100% is. And I think it's the difference between someone who would look at a map and look at the beautiful cartography and get lost in the little icons for every little bit of terrain that are there. And there's people like us who see a big blank space that just says "Here be monsters," and that is the bit that we're excited by, because You don't know what monsters are there, but you know that
Yeah.
it's bad. So let's go and
Yeah.
find out what's going on. And I think
Yeah.
that's that's probably that kind of ideological difference. And like neither is correct. It's just down to preference. But not saying that like either is correct. I do have, and Steve, I'm surprising you with this. Sorry, I should have sent you this before. I do have a little bit of support for our argument from someone who goes by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien. And this just kind of popped into my feed, and I thought, what an appropriate place to talk about it. This is an excerpt from a letter that he wrote to the poet W.H. Auden in 1955, and actually describes the draw maps, leave blanks mindset incredibly well from someone who did know a little bit about what they were talking about. And it says, I met a lot of things on the way that astonished me. Tom Bombadil I knew already, but I had never been to Bree. Strider sitting in the corner at the inn was a shock, and I had no more idea who he was than had Frodo. The mines of Moria had been a mere name, and of Lothlorien no word had reached my mortal ears till I came there. Far away I knew there were the horse lords on the confines of an ancient kingdom of men, but Fangorn Forest was an unseen adventure. I had never heard of the House of Orl, I can't remember what it is, nor the Stewards of Gondor. Most disquieting of all, Saruman had never been revealed to me, and I was as mystified as Frodo at Gandalf's failure to appear on September 22nd. And I think that's kind of like a kind of a pretty spot on summation of what we're talking about. And famously, Tolkien did actually write a lot of Lord of the Rings and Hobbit just by kind of like going YOLO, just going, right? And you look at the maps, the maps of Middle Earth are some of the most famous fantasy maps ever, but like they're not detailed. There's so much like space there to explore, and that comes across when you read his books, which I am told are quite popular.
I've heard of them.
Yeah. But yeah, so we're not saying anyone's wrong, but like Tolkien is literally saying that we're right. Is that I think
accurate? That's the takeaway.
That's the takeaway.
Yeah, that's definitely the takeaway. Yeah.
Okay. So that was my first one. What's your first one, and what game's it from, more importantly?
Well, you kind of teased this a little bit earlier. This is one of my favorite games that I've ever come across, and I love playing it. I love running it, and that is Blades in the Dark.
What a game! What a fucking game that is, Steve. It's so good.
Such a game.
Yeah.
Such a good game. Blade's good.
Yeah, Blade's good.
I'm going to say
played it. We
Blade's
played it
good.
on your channel, didn't we? We had a great time.
We did. Yeah, I thought it was a good game. If things work out in certain ways, I would love to revisit that crew and that adventure, and we'll see what might come in the future. But for now,
Tabon can blow up another horse.
That is probably in the top 3 moments in any game that I've ever run, because that was phenomenal. And we can drop a link to that episode.
We will
in the video. Yeah. So this is similar to Matt's first one. This is not necessarily a world building exercise so much as a mentality, and really it just comes from the GM section of the Blades in the Dark rulebook. And we can break it down to the major category here is ask questions. And there are a couple of things under that are like ask establishing questions, ask provocative questions, ask leading questions, ask trivial questions, ask the players for help. And similarly, building off of the idea of drawing maps and leaving blanks, one of the ways that I think that you can start to fill out that map as you're going about through play is by asking questions. And so one of my favorite things to do as a game master, and this is not revolutionary advice, but it is, I think, a really cool way to get your players engaged, especially because I have historically played with players who have been somewhat passive in their play style, and so they're kind of waiting for me to feed them the story. And so I often find that asking questions of the players is a really good way to tease out details both about themselves but also about the world. And so oftentimes if we're wandering through some forest and they're like, well, what's in this forest? I like asking establishing questions, what do you think is in this forest?
Hmm.
Or, ask a provocative question, be like, well, you've come across a moss covered half ruined tower. What do you think it is?
Hmm.
And in that way, draw the players into building the world with me, which I think is a really cool and fulfilling way to again try to connect the world to the players, because I have definitely run games where I've drawn maps and had landmarks on there that I've hoped that the players would ask after. And again, maybe it's just because some of my players have been more on the passive side of things,
Hmm.
but I've found more joy out of creating a situation where I can ask the players questions, get their answers from those, and then weave those into the fabric of the world
Yeah.
so that they are like, when that comes up again later, they can be like, wait, didn't I say that?
Hmm.
Like, that's something I came up with. And like, who isn't excited about coming up against something that you have contributed to a world? Like, it's just a great way to be engaged and excited about the world that you're building together.
Yeah, absolutely. And another good tip that I've kind of come across, which again is not revolutionary. None of these things that we're saying are things that we particularly kind of come up with. They're things that GMs do all the time. But those provocative questions you can ask, especially with newer players or more passive players, you can lead them to the answer by saying, you arrive in a town, and you want to talk about something like, I don't know, what state is the town guard in, and you turn to your player who is the fighter, for example, in this party, and say, well, as an ex-military person, you notice something about the town guard. What is it? And you're essentially not asking them, what's up with the town guard. You're giving them like, oh, you're the expert here, this is something your character would sense. And I've always found that to be a really good way of kind of giving players a bit of agency in the description if they're not quite sure of what they're doing or if they're new or whatever. But yeah, I think the GM side of Blades in the Dark, I mean, it's kind of like it's just like a textbook of how to like run a game really well, and
It is.
and be in control, but also be a guiding hand on the wheel of this ship that is careening out of control and going to crash very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's quite extraordinary. If you've never played Blaze in the Dark, I had a really weird conversation with someone the other day who'd played a ton of like role playing games, knew loads about role playing games. They never heard of Blaze in the Dark. I was really surprised. I don't know whether it's just a complete blind spot for them, but like
Yeah.
just read it and soak it up a little bit, because it is kind of super unique and super interesting. And I think some of these GM actions are so applicable to like all other games. And like you say,
Yeah.
when you are trying to collaboratively build a world, you can't do it without questioning, what's going on in the scene, questioning other characters, questioning other players. And you'll only get answers if you ask, right?
Yeah, exactly. Now,
Um,
I do have a question for you, Matt,
Go for it.
which is, have you ever been in a situation where you have turned to a player and said, "You're a military man. What do you know about the town guard?" And they just stare back at you and go, I don't know."
Well, the thing is that, I mean, I don't want to use the improv principle of yes and, right? But if,
Sure.
like, let's just say that, like, I've got a new player, I ask them the same question. You arrive in town. What do you notice about the town guard? It's the first thing you look at because you're a military man, you got training. What's the first thing you notice? And they just say, normal, I guess. And then you just jump off that. You just say, okay, well, they're a fairly bog standard, well regulated militia. This place must be, a pretty stable habitation. And they don't realize that they've given you nothing, but they actually
Yeah.
have. They've given you an
Yeah.
answer, right? And you filled that
Yeah.
in. So everything else then fits then. So okay, if you've got a bog standard town guard, this place can't be full of rich, wealthy merchants, can it? Unless
Yeah.
they've got their own private militia. Oh no, I'm off on a rabbit hole now. I'm now building a wealthy merchant's private militia in this box standard town. But like the thing is that
Perfect.
even an uninspired answer is something to work with. If they just said I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, then they're probably, I don't know, they probably shouldn't be playing a role playing game, I guess. Or like I've that sounds harsh, right? That sounds kind of super elitist of me, but
It
like
does. Yeah.
yeah. Welcome to the Super Elitist podcast. Steve is now distancing himself from my elite viewpoint. But what like I do wonder sometimes what people play games for, and I think that there are when I'm saying that like you probably shouldn't be playing a role playing game, I think you might probably be playing the wrong role playing game for you. You might want to be in
Yeah.
more of a kind of combat-y sim, kind of like dungeony, crawly kind of hack. I can't think of a famous example off the top of my head, and I won't.
Yeah.
But the thing is that like that's super fun to play those games, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
super fun to tool up with a bunch of your friends to go and hunt monsters, and if that's what you want to do, more power to you. But I think that you have to have buy-in from your characters if you're going to run a game like that. If you're going to run a game where you are going to turn to a person around the table and ask them a question about what they're noticing to help build the world, they have to agree to that. If they don't, it's going to be terrible for them. It's going to be terrible for you. So,
Yeah.
you need to tell people at the start when you're establishing what kind of game you're running, we're playing a narrative first game and, this is a world we're going to build together. It'll be fine.
Yeah. And that's ultimately the conclusion that I've come to as well of when I run games, I pretty much run for friends.
Mm-hmm.
Like I haven't run a whole lot of games for strangers. I have run a few, but for the most part, I run games for my friends. And so there are times where I'm sitting around the table with a group of people that I know fairly well. And I know that I can turn to this person and ask them this particular type of question, and they're going to give me an answer.
Mm-hmm.
And I can, if I ask this other person at the table, they might freeze up because like maybe they would feel like they don't have enough understanding of that particular area or to give an answer, or maybe they're just not interested in that specific thing. And so a lot of it comes down to knowing your players and knowing your table and talking about these things. And maybe we should do an episode on session zero and kind of buy into a campaign, because I think that's really important to kind of get a sense and to give a sense as a game master what style of play you are presenting, because you're absolutely right that if somebody comes to the table expecting to basically roll through a dungeon with their tune and just hack and slash their way through, and they sit down at a table where you or I are game mastering, like they're probably going to be sorely disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like that style of play is not wrong. It just doesn't mesh with the style of game mastering that we bring to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And I think similarly, like we would have a bad experience if we're like, all right, here's a bunch of hardcore, dungeon crawl players. I'm gonna show them the way, and I'm gonna run a highly narrative game for them where I expect a lot of role play and collaborative world building. I think I would be very disappointed in that experience. I have been disappointed in that experience. I've tried that. Doesn't work. Don't do it. So just having an expectation and an understanding of what your players are interested in when you're going into the game situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I think games like Blades in the Dark are different and have a different mentality gameplay wise than other games that people may have played. And they do tend to be a little bit more collaborative and a little bit more narrative focused. And so I think I don't want to say that you can't take those ideas from Blades in the Dark and put them into a more traditional style of game, because I think you can. And
Oh yeah.
I think people have been running you know, all sorts of different games for years doing this very thing and just not having a codified, you know, section of a rule book telling them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is important when you are pulling something from another system and sort of overlaying it onto a different style of gameplay, that you're at least aware of that possibility for some like cognitive dissonance that might come up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's again, it just comes down to knowing your players and knowing the buttons that you can push and when you can bring these things in and play with them.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And to go back to what you were saying, like I've been the sole player around a table who is at the wrong table, frankly, and is not enjoying as much as everyone else is having a great time. I was having a nice time because I was hanging out with my friends, and we were in a pub playing role playing games. But I've been the person who's getting the least out of it, and you want to just make sure that everyone is kind of getting as much out of it as they possibly can. And I think setting your expectations early is very important, and that is probably a great discussion for another time, I think.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll get to it. But at the minute we're world building. But that was Blades in the Dark, and the GM action specifically about asking questions, because sometimes you'll like the answers you receive. I'm going to talk about a game now, and this is one of the few exercises, I guess, that I've kind of taken wholesale and put into another game. This is from a game I've never actually played. This is from a game called Tech Noir, which is a very interesting game with very interesting mechanics that frankly sound like a nightmare to play. But I think if you got it right, it would be incredible. And essentially, it's there is dice rolling and stuff. It's kind of cyberpunky, but the whole game revolves around the application of adjectives. So you would roll a dice to resolve something, and then you would apply an adjective to someone using a thing. So a gun has the adjective loud, but it also would apply an adjective wounded or dead to another character, and it's super interesting. And there's actually, I think I picked this up because on the very first campaign of Friends at the Table, I watched, were running a hack of this game called Mech Noir, so like a mech version of this.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fascinated by it, and I think they all struggled with the mechanics of this game as well. But I was like, this just sounds super weird, so I got it. And we're going to do an episode in the future about NPCs and character creation, down the line. And I'll talk about this game a lot in then, because it has some incredible stuff that you can use to very easily bring characters into life. But there was a tool that's in the character creation section of this game that I use when I'm world building, and specifically if I'm world building characters into a situation. And this is what I'm talking about here. This is step 5 of character creation, which is called assign relationship adjectives. What it does is it gives 9 adjectives, and they're listed at the bottom there. We have affectionate, dependent, loyal, lustful, obsessive, protective, respectful, sympathetic, and trusting. And this exercise during character creation is you sit around the table with the players and you talk about your connections that you have in the world. And you basically take turns applying one of these adjectives to each of the connections or to each other around the table until there are none left. And it's just a really simple way of kind of establishing some kind of prior history or some kind of relationship with someone on around the table. You can't use the same adjective twice, and you have to keep going until they're all gone. And it's just super interesting. And what I did with this is for a campaign that I ran, which did not get finished, and it was wildly ambitious. It was a kind of a homebrew, my first homebrew mistake, which again is another is another title for a future video, Steve. My first homebrew
Yes.
mistake. So after having run a campaign of the Star Wars RPG, the Fantasy Flight Star Wars RPG, I thought, do you know what? I can make my own game, easy. So I took the mechanics of that game and kind of just bashed it into the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness game from the 80s, which is not a modern, flexible game, and just kind of mashed these systems together until I came up with something that was I could have done so much simply with like, just a really simple dice resolution. And but anyway, I just put hundreds of hours into doing this, lots of maps. I think I've actually got a history document of the world that it's set in. This goes to show how much I've developed as a GM and someone who runs games. I think I counted as like 6,000 words of like history of the world that they're in. I was just like, what am I doing? But anyway, I used this exercise in a chapter of that story, and it was really cool to do. So what I did was, instead of taking these relationship adjectives and applying them to the characters around the table, what I did was I had our characters arrive in a town. This town was a future version of the Maryland city of Annapolis. I believe it's the state capital. Is that right? Is that right?
That sounds right.
Yeah,
Sure.
sounds right. Yeah. Sorry, I just asked our American correspondent. Yeah,
I have to do the song.
So and it's in a kind of a future version of Annapolis, which has been overrun by mutated animals. And what I did was I'd come up with a bunch of characters, and again in a future video about NPCs, I'll show you these characters and I'll show you how I did it, because it's really it's hugely beneficial. I still do this when I come up with characters for my games. But what I did is I actually just applied all 9 of these adjectives to the players, to the characters that we would encounter. So I have found in my old notebook this incredible drawing, which Steve can look at. Now, I don't expect you to read my childish scrawl, but what I've done is I've actually mapped this out with all the characters, or key characters that my PCs would run into, and relationships they had with other characters. So we have at the top here, we have Aki and Bud Kochka. Aki is sympathetic to Bud Kochka, and Bud Kochka is loyal to Beta Amiri. Paisley Winters, great name by the way, is obsessive towards Beta Amiri. There's some great names in here. And you can see there are these other little bits, and despite having the limitation of only using each adjective once and having to use them all, that childish diagram that's on the screen now provided so much depth to the world that my characters stepped into, and provided so much kind of shorthand for like how the characters would act towards other people. Some of these characters on this in this diagram did not interact in the story, but there was some kind of connection to another character who they did interact with, and it just allowed me the license to just play around in that world and make all of the interactions with the characters feel way more believable, and therefore make the world feel more real. It didn't just feel like a bunch of names swimming around a point on a map. They felt connected to the place and connected to each other. What do you think about that, Steve? What do you think about my childish diagram?
I think that's awesome, and I'll be honest. One thing that I have in the past struggled with when running games is creating NPCs that have depth that the players don't need to see.
Mm-hmm.
Is like, usually I spend time on creating the depth that I think the players are going to need to have,
Mm-hmm.
that the NPCs are going to need to have for the players to interact with them. But what I really like about this is like some of these connections like might have nothing to do with the plot or the quest that the characters are on or any of that stuff. But just the fact that that that's there
Yep.
means that you are thinking about, it I think helps you get into the mindset of that NPC when you're playing it, playing them, interacting with your characters, and it gives you an opportunity to convey a life and a reality that goes beyond just the like, well, here's your quest, now get out of here and go do the adventurer thing. So I think it's amazing, and I'm totally stealing this.
Yeah, and can I tell you why I like it so much? Because whilst you and I have talked about our kind of attitudes over time change towards prepping adventures and prepping sessions and prepping games and stuff.
Yeah.
This seems like it establishes a lot, right? But it's an arrow and one word. That is all
Yeah.
it is. It is an arrow pointing in a direction and one word. And again, we'll come back to this in an NPC episode and the strength of adjectives when applied to characters. You can do an awful lot with one word. So, like, you can see like a line going down from Paisley Winters towards Beta Ramiri. It just says the word obsessive. And you can get so much mileage out of that, like so much mileage out of that. And I was just really, really shocked because I think I did this because I just wanted to use something from Tech Noir in this game. And what I was, surprised at just how efficiently it did the heavy lifting with just that. And that is a diagram that I came back to, and in my notebook, which is literally here, this is where this has come from, with my, hang on, it's got like a holographic stormtroopers on the front. There is other notes and stuff written all around this diagram that I never used, but I used that diagram an awful lot.
Yeah.
And it's something that I came back to, and it's something that, like I said, added an awful lot of depth and richness to the relationships, and therefore the world, and therefore the story. So this is a kind of like a character tool, but I'd specifically used it for NPCs to flesh out a more believable world, and for something that is so low effort in terms of, you scroll it on a piece of paper with a pencil. I think it's kind of unbeatable, really. And Tech Noir has a load of other tools for like world building, like from the world building bit. Like they've got this kind of plot threads table, which can be randomly generated, or can be you can kind of pick from them, and you can pick locations and factions and stuff and put them in these little maps where you join them together with these little lines and adjectives. And it's really smart. So yeah, if you can find a copy of Tech Noir somewhere, probably on drive-thru or something, get it, because you might not play the game. And this is true of all RPGs, right? You might not play the game, but there'll be something in there that's good, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's my rambling about this. I think this is from 2014, this diagram. So that's this piece of history, nearly 10 years old now. What have you got for your last pick?
So my last pick is a game that I have not played, and it's on my list of I definitely want to play this. But this particular tool is something that I have used, although in the fantasy version.
Mm-hmm.
And so the game is Stars Without Number, and the tool is the faction turn system.
Yeah.
And this is a whole bunch of text. So whereas the first few that we talked about were all, one page or even just a handful of words,
Mm-hmm.
this is like an easy like 15 to 20 pages
Mm-hmm.
of details and various rules and all sorts of things. But I use this in the second season of my show, the fantasy version of it, to replicate the movement of the factions in the fantasy city that my mercenaries were operating in. And it gave me an opportunity to kind of draw back from the very specific action that was going on around my characters and look at the wider political action that was going on in the city. And the way that the system works, and I'll just go over it pretty briefly, is that much like a character, you create a faction with hit points and then with various attribute ratings, and those ratings are around their force, their cunning, and their wealth, and then how much money that they have, where their homeworld is, and then their tags. And their tags are special traits that give you different bonuses, sometimes to rolls, sometimes they're more narrative. And you create your faction. You can buy assets with your wealth. You can your assets break down into those different categories of force, cunning, and wealth. And for instance, you could buy an asset. If we look at the cunning assets, you could buy some smugglers or cyber ninjas or tripwire cells. All of these different assets are available to your faction. And so as a game master, you create the factions that your characters are going to come across and interact with. And this is almost a little mini game that you can play in between sessions to kind of see how the world is progressing around your characters and their actions. And so I have used this pretty extensively in the past for my second season, and I'm toying with the idea of using this particular sci-fi version in my upcoming campaign to do a similar thing of just keeping track of the factions and what they're doing. And it doesn't take long. I mean, most of my faction turns were between like half an hour to 45 minutes. And that was, I think, mostly because I was narrating and trying to like talk through what the different factions were doing after I rolled the various um, actions. So when you're going through a turn, you can choose from a list of different actions. So you can attack another faction, you can buy an asset, you can repair an asset, you can try to seize a planet. You can use an asset's ability. You can expand your influence, which means you're basically founding a base on another planet. And it's this whole mini game where you just go through each faction. And I think that there's a set time in the game where it's like, each faction turn is a month. Um, but when I was doing it, I was focused on a more fast paced action. And because all of the action was taking place in one fantasy city, I changed it around to being about a week. So each faction turn covered about a week, and the different factions would move around. And I tried to then, in the background, represent those changes, the successes and the failures that the different factions had as they were going through this turn. I had to represent that in the fiction as I was going through my season. And so I really, really like this tool as a way to really kind of get into the nitty gritty of what's going on in your world. What are the factions doing around the world, whether it's fantasy or science fiction or cyberpunk or whatever. You can build up these factions. And then again, talking about prep is play, I don't necessarily want to build a map. I don't want to draw a big map with really fine details, but I love creating a half dozen factions and playing a little mini game with myself where I roll a few dice, and that feedback that I get from that helps me to envision the world differently every time I finish that faction turn and be like, all right, well, this faction's on the rise and this faction is, ran into some troubles. And now I can go back to my characters in the game that I'm playing and say, okay, the stuff happened. How does it affect you? How would you like to affect it? Because there is an aspect of that too, of like, can your characters impact the faction turn? Do you have a group of characters that are the cell that your faction, the asset that they bought? Your characters are a bunch of smugglers. They just bought an asset that's a bunch of smugglers. Like, is that your team? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is that your crew? And so I think it's a cool way to bring together the idea of continuing to build the world as you play and creating a world that is more vibrant and living, because you don't have to come up with all that stuff on your own. You can leave a certain amount of randomness to it. And again, there are some people who have no problem coming up with factions and moving those factions around. And I've done that plenty in my games as well. But I also like the idea of kind of playing a game separately from the actual like characters in the plot or whatever you want to call it,
Mm-hmm.
that feeds back to me as a game master. And again, whether I'm playing solo or playing in a group, it feels like sitting down and playing the game.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm here for. Like, I like prep that feels like I'm playing the game.
Yeah, 100%. And slight confession, during your second season, I really liked your faction turns. I really liked that we had this kind of zooming out, this kind of macro level like play. I felt they were really nice palate cleansers, and also it built tension for when you cut back to Ben and what else was happening. But after hearing you do it, I kind of stole the idea. I didn't actually use a formal mechanical way of doing it, but it was during that time listening to your second season that I was like, right, I've got a lot of moving pieces in my story and a lot of big factions that are quite powerful, and they're not just going to be sitting idly by while this tiny micro story plays out. So I actually started thinking more about what was going on, and I didn't really go into that much detail, but I just wanted to know. And then I think as my story's gone on, I've fed back, and sometimes we get these narrative cutaways in my campaign where we find out a little bit about what's going on in the background. That's all inspired by your faction turns from this, and I really like the idea of formalizing that to a like a mini game and actually playing that out and adding some more randomness to it. I didn't go into anywhere near as much detail, but if you wanted to, this is an amazing tool to do that.
Yeah. And I think that's the great thing, is like, you don't have to go into that much detail. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you could literally just write out a list of factions and roll a d6. And, anytime a faction interacts with another faction, you just roll a d6. Maybe you say, oh, well, this faction has +1 because they've got these different assets. You don't have to necessarily go into having all of this detail.
Mm-hmm.
I do really enjoy, because as much as I love narrative gaming, like, every once in a while, I want some numbers to crunch,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I want to have a little bit of like strategy and tactics of like looking at a situation and being like, all right, well, these are my strengths. Like, this faction's strengths are their military force, and this faction's strength is their bureaucratic force. Like, if I push those two factions together, who's going to come out on top?
Mm-hmm.
And I could just decide who comes out on top, but I really like rolling dice and discovering. And I think this is something for me that I've discovered, is like, I play these games and I create the actual play content that I do in the way that I do, because I could just go write a novel
Oh yeah, yeah.
and decide all those things for myself. And I've done that and I enjoy doing that. But this ticks a different part of my creativity. And I really enjoy getting that feedback. And that was something that I was concerned about going into playing solo originally, was like, well, how am I going to get that feedback that I get when I'm sitting around a table with other people,
Mm-hmm.
where we're talking about a situation and I say something and then somebody else says something and it's like, oh, that makes me think of this over here. Let's do, and it just builds and builds and builds. And I think for me, having oracle tables to roll on that I can react to, and then having these little like mini games that I can sometimes even just bolt on to other games helps me to feel like I'm guiding a story through my season, my campaign, whatever,
Yeah.
but I'm also still playing a game, and I'm still rolling dice, and things are coming up randomly, and I'm going, I don't know how to take that. Okay, we've got to figure out a new path,
Yeah.
and that's really exciting.
I think the faction turn thing it fits so well with your second season, because something like Scup, which talks a lot about intrigue and these the machinations of powerful entities playing each other off against the scenes, is really interesting. And I think that it's nice to think about how some tools fit some systems perfectly. This would fit Blades in the Dark, actually, with the factions and stuff. I mean, there is tools for that in Blades in the Dark, but if you really wanted to, you could use this as a kind of supplement or instead of, to work out what all these powerful entities are doing. And I think it's really fun. And it's just kind of giving me ideas now, but in a story and in a game where there are powerful factions, an element of randomness is actually quite interesting, because when your character is kind of like a pawn in a game, it's interesting if randomness pushes some of the faction activity like in an area you wouldn't think about, and kind of that makes it kind of unpredictable and kind of like incendiary and kind of chaotic, is actually really interesting, because then your character has to react to all these things that are happening, or might be walking into stuff they don't know has happened, which is really interesting. And I think it's a great little tool. So that's our little rundown of some of our favorite world building tools, and some of them we've just kind of like crowbarred into being world building tools, even though they really aren't, but they kind of are. If you've got any at home that you want to like tell us about that you like, stick them in the comments below. And what we talk about, do you want to talk about NPCs next time? I think we've mentioned it like 18 times in this episode, and I think we probably should.
I feel like that's a natural continuation of this discussion.
Yeah, and I think that we do stay abreast of, like, we're asked questions and stuff on our individual shows, and you kind of see it if you spend any time in various subreddits, that like there are things that people who especially focus on solo play not struggle with, but sometimes find it difficult to do as easy as they would around a table, and that's coming up with NPCs or making your character do meaningful things are definitely two that come up all the time. So I think we'll do something like that. But for this one, I think it was all right, wasn't it?
I think so. Yeah. I think we covered a decent amount about world building, and I think we could talk about world building for hours upon hours.
Yeah. And we didn't even mention the Quiet Year once.
Oh,
which is obviously the best world building tool there is. But we discussed this beforehand, that if we did, it would just be a whole episode of the Quiet Year.
Yeah, there's a big old caveat.
Yeah,
Matt.
Yeah.
Maybe if people enjoy this discussion of world building, and would like more world building content from us, maybe we would consider doing a session of the Quiet Year on a video, or even a live stream or something like that.
Yeah, or like Microscope or something. Have you done Microscope?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really fun.
I've read it many times, but I have not actually played it yet.
Yeah. I've kind of fooled around with it, but not quite gone there. If you want to see us play the Quiet Year, how good's your drawing? Like
terrible, but it doesn't matter.
We're gonna do it using Microsoft Paint. The most awful Quiet. You'll be like, I want the frost giants to turn up and wipe this civilization out immediely. Get to winter. Get rid of these awful people. I've had a blast playing the Quiet Year. It's so good. If people want that, let's do it. Give them what they want. But they'll probably just play Starforged.
I mean,
Starforged. Good.
We could just world build Starforged for an hour. That's fine.
We'll just prep loads of games and never play them. Yeah, that's how it is.
That's real life, man. That's real life.
Yeah, cool. So that's it for us, and we will be back next month with probably NPCs. If not, we'll be playing The Quiet Year on Microsoft Paint. Okay, everyone, goodbye.
See ya.